Rwanda's invasion was supported by Uganda and Burundi, while the DRC was backed up by troops coming from their former enemy Angola, along with Chad, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, while dozens of various rebel militias supported one side or the other. A complicated web of alliances that have led some people to call this conflict the African World War. Laurent Kabila, the president of the DRC who was installed during the First Congo War, was assassinated in 2001 as the war continued, and his son, Joseph Kabila, assumed power in the DRC in his place. Between 2002 and 2003, the junior Kabila entered into peace negotiations with the Rwandans that ended the fighting of the Second Congo War after nearly 5 years of apocalyptic warfare. The massive scale of the fighting and the widespread famines and other humanitarian disasters that were directly caused by that war caused millions of deaths according to multiple different sources. Between 3 million deaths according to lower estimates up to as many as 5.4 million deaths according to higher estimates, making the Second Congo War, fought between 1998 and 2003, by far the deadliest conflict fought in history since the Second World War, and tragically known about by hardly anybody in the Western world. In the aftermath of the war, a tenuous peace was reached, but instability continued reigning supreme in the eastern DRC, in the frontier provinces of South and North Kivu, and also Ituri, along the borders with Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. More than 100 different armed militia and rebel groups have since been sparked into existence here across the eastern DRC, as the central government of the country has struggled immensely for decades with maintaining its authority in the area. This is largely because still to this day, the DRC has no railways or even any paved roads that connect North and South Kivu to the rest of the country. The DRC's capital, Kinshasa, is around 1,500 kilometers away from the major cities here in Goma and Bukavu, and everything the DRC wants to transport to them, whether it's troops or supplies, have to cross vast distances largely over gravel highways if they're lucky, or muddy flooded earth tracks if they're not so lucky. Meanwhile, Goma and Bukavu are both literally right across the border from Rwanda and only about 100 kilometers away from the Rwandan capital of Kigali, while Rwanda today has a much more extensive network of paved roads than the DRC has, with paved highways that can efficiently carry troops and supplies leading directly to both Goma and Bukavu straight from the capital, Kigali. Now, among those 100-plus militias and rebel groups that came to exist in the eastern DRC was a major Hutu extremist militia with members who directly perpetrated the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, called the FDLR. The FDLR came to prominence in the eastern DRC during the 2000s, and they rapidly attracted thousands of radical Hutu fighters to their cause. And they found themselves in conflict both with the DRC government and a Congolese Tutsi militia that also formed in the North Kivu province that was known as the CNDP, the predecessor organization to the modern Tutsi M23 militia. For years across the 2000s, it was basically a three-way insurgency in the eastern DRC between the Hutu extremist FDLR militia, the Tutsi CNDP militia, and the DRC government until, on the 23rd of March 2009, the Tutsi CNDP militia agreed on a peace treaty with the DRC government. This date, March 23rd of 2009, is where the later M23 movement would take its name from. A few years later, in 2012, alleging that the DRC government had failed to adequately implement the March 23rd peace treaty, hundreds of mostly Tutsi officers and soldiers within the DRC military, who were largely former members of the CNDP militia, mutinied and formed the new M23 rebel militia. It's widely believed that almost immediately after, M23 began being supported and armed by the Rwandan state intelligence and security agencies, and they were able to rapidly overwhelm a swath of territory in the DRC's North Kivu province, culminating with them managing to capture North Kivu's provincial capital of Goma, just like they would do much later again in January of 2025. But that first time they did it in 2012, Rwanda faced a catastrophic tsunami of international pressure to abandon M23 and to give up their seized control over Goma. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of annual aid to Rwanda was sanctioned by countries from around the world, including the US, UK, and France, which for a country that relied on foreign aid for at least 1/3 of its entire government budget was immediately catastrophic. The UN authorized an offensive brigade to be created within the UN peacekeeping mission to the eastern DRC, known as MONUSCO, to fight alongside the DRC government against M23. Under unbearable international pressure, Rwanda relented and abandoned all of their support for M23 in 2012, which led to M23 being decisively defeated and kicked out of Goma by the DRC army and UN peacekeepers. By 2013, the UN peacekeeping mission in the eastern DRC had swelled in size to become the largest UN troop deployment in the entire world, with around 18,000 peacekeepers deployed to the mission. M23 was quickly militarily defeated and then went dormant and kept a low profile for years until very recently in 2021, when it would finally re-emerge back onto the world stage once again. But over the 8 years in between that time, Rwanda adopted a clever strategy of boosting its image across the Western world and making itself as useful and important to the Western world as possible, so that the next time it wanted to use M23 as a proxy force of conquest in the Eastern DRC, the sanctions that crippled and undermined their ambitions in 2012 would never happen again. In particular, Rwanda began aggressively investing into its own armed forces and began positioning itself as a bastion of stability in Africa that the Western world could reliably depend upon to solve problems elsewhere on the continent. Rwanda has since become the world's second largest police and troop contributor to UN peacekeeping missions, and the largest contributor to them in Africa. Right now, in 2025, Rwanda has more than 5,000 of their soldiers deployed to various UN peacekeeping missions, a massive amount for a country of their relatively small size.